We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings, secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
Welcome to Conspiracy Corner Podcast, everyone. This is Abe, your host. Just got home at 7:42. Had to stay a little late. We just had a big-ass truck, man. I had to pull back like 3 pallets, which will be waiting on me tomorrow. Well, tonight, I should say. Yeah, not much has been going on. Just been working, listening to podcasts. That's about it. Sleeping, eating. But today we are going to be covering 3 real weird stories. This will probably be the last of any stories taken from Mothman prophecies, because I pretty much gave you guys all the nuggets. I will, if you guys want, because some of these podcasts are like little mini series. I can start a playlist, so I'll title it John A. Keel podcast, and that way you guys can check and see if you missed any episodes. But it'll all be Mothman prophecy related stories, and an interview with John A. Keel. Some interesting stuff if you like that subject, and you might have missed an episode here or there because notifications. I'm sure people don't get all the notifications, But that's about it. We'll get started. Did you ever hear of anyone, especially an Air Force officer, trying to drink Jell-O? Mrs. Ralph Butler of Owatonna, Minnesota asked. Well, that's what he did. He acted like he had never seen any before. He picked up the bowl and tried to drink it. I had to show him how to eat it with a spoon. Mrs. Butler was describing the man who had visited her in May 1967 following a flurry of UFO sightings in Owatonna. He said he was Major Richard French of the United States Air Force, although he was dressed in civilian clothes and was driving a white Mustang. His neat gray suit and everything else he was wearing appeared to be brand new. Even the soles of his shoes were unscuffed, unwalked upon. He was about 5 feet 9 inches tall, with an olive complexion and pointed face. Yeah, with these strange encounters, especially one of the last episodes that I did, it was episode The Mysterious Mount Misery. That's which one it was. It was all about, you'll notice a trend of they have olive colored skin and sharp, pointed faces. His hair was dark and very long, too long for an Air Force officer, Mrs. Butler thought. Unlike Jack Brown, Major French was a fluent conversationalist and seemed perfectly normal until he complained about his stomach bothering him. When Mrs. Butler offered him the Jell-O, she suspected for the first time that something was out of kilter. Richard French was an imposter, one of the many wandering around the United States in 1967. For years, these characters had caused acute paranoia among the flying saucer enthusiasts, convincing them that the Air Force was investigating them. silencing witnesses, and indulging in all kinds of unsavory activities, including murder. When I first began collecting such reports, I was naturally suspicious of the people making such reports. And this is John Keel, by the way. It all seemed like a massive put on, but gradually it became apparent that the same minute details were turning up in widely separated cases, and none of these details had been published anywhere, not even in the little newsletters of the UFO cultist. There was somebody out there, all right. A few, like Richard French, almost pulled off their capers without drawing attention to themselves. But in nearly every case, there was always some small error, some slip of dress or behavior which the witnesses were usually willing to overlook, but which stood out like signal flares to me. They often arrived in old model cars which were as shiny, as well kept as brand new vehicles. Sometimes they slipped up in their dress, wearing clothes that were out of fashion, or even more perturbing, would not come into fashion until years later. Those who posed as military officers obviously had no knowledge of military procedure or basic military jargon. If they had occasion to pull out a wallet or notebook, it would be brand new. Although most men carry beat-up old wallets and notebooks quickly gain a worn look. Finally, like the fairies of old, they often collected souvenirs from the witnesses, delighted, walking away with an old magazine, a pen, or small or expendable object. What troubled me most was the fact that the mystery men and women often matched the descriptions given to me by contactees who claimed to have seen a UFO land and had glimpsed or conversed with their pilots with either pointed features or oriental countenances, dusky skin, and unusually long fingers. So that was a strange encounter. A dude drinking Jello from a straw. Alright, so here we have another strange account. On the afternoon of January 9th, 1967, Edward Christensen and his family returned to their new home in Wildwood, New Jersey after a trip to Florida. They had just moved into the new house, some distance from the place where they had lived at the time of their November UFO sighting. Neither their address nor phone number was listed in the then current phone book. They entered their house by the back door. The front door was still heavily bolted and locked, the way they had left it when they had gone to Florida. At 5:30 p.m. there was a knock on the front door. Mrs. Arlene Christensen was in the kitchen preparing dinner. "Check and see who that is," she told her 17-year-old daughter Connie. "If it's a salesman, don't answer." Connie took a peek and reported back, "It's the strangest looking man I've ever seen." Mrs. Christensen went to the door, unbolted, and unlatched it. It was growing dark and was bitter cold outside. There was no car in view, and this seemed peculiar because the Christensens' home was removed from any other houses in a rather isolated spot. A tall man stood on the doorstep. "Does Edward Christensen live here?" he asked. Arlene admitted he did. "I'm from the Missing Heirs Bureau," the man continued. "Mr. Christensen may have inherited a great deal of money. May I come in?" It was an approach that was hard to resist. She stepped back and invited him in, calling out to her husband. Edward Christensen is 6 feet 2 inches tall, and heavy set. The stranger towered over him and must have been at least 6 feet 6 inches tall. He was also enormously broad and might have weighed at least 300 pounds. He wore a fur Russian-style hat with a black visor on it, and a very long black coat that seemed to be made of thin material, too thin for the cold weather. "This will only take 40 minutes," he said, as he removed his hat and revealed an unusual head, large and round, while his face seemed angular and pointed. So there you go with the pointed faces again. He had black hair. There's another one, black hair. He had black hair which was closely cropped to his head, as if his head had been shaved and the hair was just growing in again. There was a perfectly round spot on the back of his head, as if the area had recently been shaved. His nose and mouth seemed relatively normal, but his eyes were large, protruding like thyroid eyes, and set wide apart. So basically, he looks like the mayor of Chicago. Sorry, I couldn't resist myself. And set wide apart. One eye appeared to have a cast, like a glass eye, and did not move in unison with its companion. Edward Christensen told him at the outset that a mistake had been made, that he could not believe that anyone had left him any money. The man assured him that he might, indeed, be the Edward Christensen he was seeking, and in order to verify, he would like to ask him some questions. He removed his coat. There was a badge on his shirt pocket, which he quickly covered with his hand and removed, placing it in his coat pocket. It looked like a gold or brass badge, Connie told me later, but it wasn't an ordinary police badge or anything like that. We just got a glimpse of it, but it seemed to have a big K on it, with a small X alongside. So KX. I have no idea what that would be. If anyone does know, hit me up in the comments, because that's strange. I've read this years ago, but I don't know, that's just odd. If anyone's got any theories or anything. And there were some letters or numbers around the edge. It was obvious he didn't want us to see it. He was not wearing a suit jacket. Underneath his thin outer coat, he was wearing a short-sleeved shirt made of dacron-like material. His trousers were of dark material, gray or black, and were a little too short. When he sat down, they rode high up on his calves. He wore dark socks and dark shoes with unusually thick rubber soles. That's another thing, like with these sightings of just strange people, olive-skinned, and I don't know, they all have like thick soles on their shoes, which is odd. Arlene and Connie were most fascinated by a strange feature on his leg. When he sat down, they could see a long, thick green wire attached to the inside of his leg. It came up out of his socks and disappeared under his trousers. At one point, it seemed to be indented into his leg and was covered by a large brown spot. Connie seemed to have studied him the most carefully and gave the best description. In many ways, this odd man shared the characteristics of Mary Hyer's tiny visitor of only a few days earlier. Mrs. Hyer said the little man had unusually pale skin, almost a sickly white. The Christensens said their visitor had an unnatural pallor. They assumed he was sick. His speech was also strange, with a high, tinny, quote-unquote, voice that seemed peculiar, coming from such a large man. He spoke in a dull, emotionless monotone, and clipped words and phrases like a computer. Connie said that he sounded as if he were reciting everything from memory, or he was wearing a wire. Thinking about the wire running up his leg, he was probably wearing a wire, you know. Mrs. Hyer told me her tiny visitor had spoken in a hard-to-understand, sing-song manner, like a recording. Both men wore unusually thick rubber-sole shoes. Both were ill-dressed for the weather, and both had eccentric haircuts. Small points, perhaps, but significant in these cases. After the man had introduced himself, none of the family could remember his name. They all said it was something common like Brown or Smith. And they did remember that he said his friends had called him Tiny. The family dog Gigi snarled and barked at him. He spoke to the dog and calmed it. When Tiny had seated himself, Mrs. Christensen told him that they were about to eat and asked him if he wanted to join them. He replied that he was on a diet, but that he would like a glass of water in about 10 minutes. It's so weird how, it'll only be 40 minutes, very precise on the time. He seemed to wheeze, they all noted, like a man with asthma, and he appeared to have difficulty breathing. Tiny produced a small notebook and a pen and assured the family that this was not any kind of confidence game. He was looking for an Edward Christensen who was due to inherit a large sum of money, and he would need information about Ed's past history to determine if he was the man. He then proceeded to ask a long series of questions. Did Ed have any scars or birthmarks? Ed said he had a scar on his back from an operation and an appendix scar. Tiny asked for every detail, the length, width, the exact position of those scars. He also asked for a complete list of all the schools Ed had attended, and the number and type of auto vehicles the family owned. At one point, he asked the couple if they were willing to fly to any place in the United States to collect the inheritance, explaining that they would have to be present when the will was read. Ed and Arlene agreed that they could make themselves available for such a trip. According to Connie, Tiny's face gradually grew redder and redder as he talked. After a few minutes, he turned to her and asked, "May I have that glass of water now?" She fetched the water for him, and he took out a large yellow capsule, which he gulped down. He returned to normal after taking it. That's weird. Tiny mentioned 3 specific names and asked Ed if he recognized any of them. He did not, and later, he was able to remember only one of them, Roy Stevens. Connie said she thought another of the names was Taylor, but she wasn't sure. At this time, Ed did not know about Gwendolyn Martino's Gwen Stevens, wrong numbers in December, nor had Gwen heard about Tiny and the 3 names until I interviewed the family in late February 1967. When we had started out by discussing their UFO sighting in November. Then I began to ask my routine far-out questions. This is John Keel now. When I asked them if they had received any unusual visitors after their sighting, they looked at each other with the shock of recognition. I separated them and interviewed each member of the family individually. All of their statements coincided exactly. Since 5 witnesses were involved, Mr. and Mrs. Christensen and their 3 children, all above average intelligence and very observant, I regarded this as an outstanding M.I.B. type Men in Black report. I did not publish it until 2 years later, withholding the details to preclude possible hoaxes. Tiny concluded his interview less than an hour after he arrived. It was probably precisely 40 minutes, just as he promised. He donned his hat and coat and told Ed he would be notified by mail within 10 days. Arlene was in the kitchen when he left. She decided that she was going to watch him and see where he went. She stepped out of the kitchen door and stood in the dark watching the big man as he walked toward the road. His shoes squished loudly as he walked, she noted. When he reached the road, he made a gesture with his hand, and a black 1963 Cadillac drove through the trees and pulled up. It was driving in the pitch dark, and its headlights out, so she couldn't see the driver. Tiny climbed into the car, and it drove away, its headlights still out. The next morning, Ed was alone in the house when the phone rang. A female voice explained she was calling about the missing heir interview. "We've located the Edward Christensen we're looking for in California," she explained. Ed said that he felt sure he wasn't the right one, thanked her, and hung up. When he told his family about the call, they all dismissed the incident from their minds until my interview with them. The wire running up the leg is one feature I have been unable to fit into my research and other M.I.B cases. It has never been repeated. Was Tiny wearing electric socks? Or was he a wired android operated by remote control? As for his badge, I suspect that the K was really the Greek letter sigma, and it's like a sideways M is what it shows. I don't know what sigma that is, which has turned up repeatedly in other UFO cases, and is often used by scientists to express the strange or unknown. So I don't know, guys. What do you think of that? I did have a request to. This was actually a long time ago, but if there's still a subscriber, someone had a request that I do an M.I.B episode or video. So there you go. There you have it. An M.I.B account is what John A. Keel says. I just think they're just strange encounters in general. I don't know. It's bizarre. Let me know what you guys think. But I got one more account for you all, and yeah, if we got time, I might add another segment or not. But all right, and I'll probably sum it up with this story. Here's the final story for this podcast of I guess just another strange encounter. I'm not sure if I want to name this episode Strange Encounters or Men in Black, so we shall see. Mrs. Mary Hire entertained the first of her long string of peculiar visitors early in January 1967. She was working late in her office opposite the country courthouse when her door opened and a very small man entered. He was about 4 feet 6 inches tall, she told me in the phone call soon afterward. Although it was 20 degrees Fahrenheit outside, he was wearing nothing but a short-sleeved blue shirt and blue trousers of thin-looking material. So there's that thin-looking material again. It's a common thing. His eyes were dark and deep set, and were covered with thick-lensed glasses. He was wearing odd shoes with very thick soles. Once again, thick soles, which probably added an inch or two to his height. Speaking in a low, halting voice, he asked her for directions to Welch, West Virginia, a town in the southeastern tip of the state. She thought at first that he had some kind of speech impediment. His black hair, once again black hair, ladies and gentlemen, was long and cut squarely like a bowl haircut, and his eyes remained fixed on her in an unflinching, hypnotic way. He kept getting closer and closer, she reported, his funny eyes staring at me almost hypnotically. He told her a long-winded, just disjointed story about his truck breaking down in Detroit, Michigan. He had hitchhiked all the way from Detroit. As he talked, he inched closer and closer to her, and she became frightened, thinking she had some kind of a nut on her hands. She pulled back from her desk and ran into the back room where her newspaper circulation manager was working on a telephone campaign. He joined her and they spoke together to the little man. He seemed to know more about West Virginia than we did, she declared later. At one point the telephone rang, and while she was speaking on it, the little man picked up a ballpoint pen from her desk and examined it with amazement, as if he had never seen a pen before. You can have that if you want, she offered. He responded with a loud, peculiar laugh, a kind of cackle. Then he ran out into the night and disappeared around a corner. The next day, Mrs. Heyer checked with the sheriff's officer to find out if there was any mentally deficient person on the loose. The answer was negative. So I don't know, guys. Bizarre, definitely. Sorry if it was a shorter episode, but I gathered up as much as I could from John A. Keel's accounts of just strange encounters. I think it's bizarre as heck. It's just, I don't know. I wanted to share those with you guys because those were like 3 different encounters that I had read years ago, and I never forgot them. I just remember them being just like super weird, and I'm like, man, I have got to put that on the podcast. But I hope you all enjoyed, and you all have a good day.
We are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, opposed to secret oaths, opposed to secret proceedings. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.